see this title, you may well think to yourself, how's that going to relate to fantasy and betting at esports pool? But actually, my friend, you haven't thought about it, have you? Because see, a lot of people, many people, I don't know if it's a lot, many, some, consider me to be arrogant. Now, you know, don't really see it myself. I'd probably just say I am that good. But then again, in that way, perhaps I prove their point. But you might not know that a lot of users of esports pools would tell you that their service is excellent. I mean, they offer fantasy and betting for CSGO, Dota 2, League of Legends, Overwatch, StarCraft, StarCraft 2. They even offer it for Call of Duty and Hearthstone, which, you know, I could have mentioned with that other list. You might think, why separate them? Because the thing is, I'm only interested in esports. Now, the thing about arrogance is arrogance and confidence can actually be very difficult to differentiate between, and it's often a matter of perspective as to which you will interpret statements as. Because think about this, imagine someone has not yet done something incredible, and therefore you think they probably won't, but you can't really know if they're actually just about to do that very thing that they claim they can do. So imagine someone comes into a tournament who's never won a big competition before, and you know what, they talk a lot of shit, or they talk themselves up a lot, they say they're the best player in the world, no one at the competition can beat them, no one can even stand against them, actually they're going to destroy them all, right? In that moment, you, quite rightfully, should probably doubt them. You should probably even make a little pencil mark in your mind next to their name and say, possibly delusional. But if they then go on to make good on their very words that they'd said, and suddenly, guess what? Their bravado is now transformed into a legendary display of confidence, which will certainly make the storyline of them winning a lot more exciting, will become part of the mystique, the mythos of what they were able to accomplish in their career. And yet, had they failed entirely, you would just continue on the original trajectory and say delusional, you know, maybe they should talk a bit less shit and actually hone their game a bit more. So whether they won or lost, what was an identical set of actions suddenly has a different outcome in terms of how you think of it based on the outcome being different. Your perception of it is what will change based on whether they win or lose. Because the thing is, if someone is, in this sense, arrogant or confident, but can then back it up, now it becomes something more than just what they were able to do in the game, because this arrogance, this confidence becomes infectious, it becomes compelling, it becomes electrifying. Suddenly, this is someone you're going to pay even more attention to than just based on the fact they've won, or perhaps if they have an exciting style of play. With that said, yes, nobody wants to hear from a guy who sucks talking about how good he is and talking trash on players that are much better than him. Yeah, that gets old real fast, so it's definitely a gamble. So I'll give you some examples from esports history of when this kind of arrogance or confidence had this strange, compelling, attractive effect. So back in the days of Quake, one of my favorite players was a player called Machiavelli. He was a Quake 3 dueler. He was also a Quake 2 player, but these stories are from Quake 3. And in the very early days of Quake 3, we're talking like 1999, 2000, he was one of the best players in the world. And the thing about Machiavelli was he was not just one of the best, but he had also become one of the best by learning. His natural style of play was very wild, very erratic, but very aim and skill heavy. But he had learned to become a disciplined player and then become a champion at the end of Quake 2 by learning from his friend, who was one of the best players of Quake of all time, arguably the best Quake dueler of all time, especially at that point in time was the best, someone called Thresh, who was the master of the disciplined style of Quake, where you really push your advantages, you played a controlled game, you beat the enemy with your mind as well as your skills, but even then you didn't take as many chances with your skills. And as a result of having learned this style of play, he tried to embody this in Quake 3. But he still always had back there lurking in the back of his mind and of his persona, his personality, that element that had made him very good before he'd learned this disciplined style from Thresh, which was this wild streak. It was this switch he could flip where he played aggressively and just off aim and took the match to someone and made it chaotic and might win or might lose. So there was a crazy game in one of the first big tournaments that he was involved in where he finished second at the Razer CPL in, I think it was around the spring of 2000, I think it was. Yes, I think so. Where he actually was only able to finish second at this tournament because he was in a game he was losing on Tourney 4, which is the famous three-tiered map where you play mainly around the rail and the red armor. And he was playing against a player called Power K from Korea, who's a very skilled mechanical player. And through that tournament had been pretty impressive and ended up finishing third in this tournament. And Power K was up in a game. Actually, maybe I'm mistaken this one. I can't remember. There's two games that happened like this. There was one against Power K, I remember. And then there was one against Wombat at the Excess Reality back then. Excess Reality Invitational. There was two games like this where similar circumstances, similar map, and he's playing against a player where they get ahead of him, and he just plays this all-out style. He flips the switch. He plays in quite somewhat an arrogant fashion. He doesn't play a controlled game or try and get back into the game or fight for an item in a very controlled manner or set up a trap or anything. He just battles back, uses pure aim, pure aggression, pure brute force, wills himself back into this game where he absolutely also put himself in massive danger of getting blown out completely, wins the game, goes on, makes it top 2 in the tournament. Later in the same year, at the Babbage's CPL tournament, again, actually the last truly massive competition in Quake, because this is another one that had a huge prize pool, and at the time Quake was still in full swing as the main esports game and a lot of players playing competitively. Everyone had practiced for this last tournament of the year. At the time they didn't know Quake was going to kind of get cancelled as a Premier Esports title, and everyone was going. This was going to be everyone's big payday who was a good player. All the best players attended this tournament. And there was one of the top North American players who's largely forgotten now, is a player called C3, this West Coast player. And at the time, people remember Fatality was the #1 player from NA. Machiavelli was still very good, but had been a little bit distant because he hadn't gone to the European CPLs. You had CZM was on the rise, amazing TDM player, had shown some skills as a duel player, but this was his first big duel tournament. And C3 was right in the mix there, and he'd beaten 0-4 at times, he'd lost to Fatality at times, he'd shown himself he was very good online, but he was coming into this tournament, and you might think someone as good as him, he gets deep down in the tournament. We're talking like last 8 players left. This is where all the real money is. Every step up in the last 8 players, you're really getting like thousands more. Then eventually, once you get to the top 4, the top 3, you're doubling, tripling, you're getting really big money. So those are the games, in theory, you want to play as safe as possible and just try and get another notch up the ladder. But he played against a player, also interestingly enough, another Korean player, but I'm not sure. I think this guy was just ethnically Korean. I think he was actually lived in America. I'm not sure on that detail, though. A guy called Elan. Another player, famous for his mechanical skill and his rail. That's why I've always found it funny that people say Koreans can't play FPS games. When Koreans play FPS games seriously, they get some fucking insanely good mechanical players, because that you'd guess from seeing all the other games, they're amazing skill-wise as well when you get the cream of the crop. So this guy, this is what a baller this C3 guy was. He actually wanted to play and get himself fired up based on how fun the competition was, despite the fact he's in a massive money tournament, there's all these great players, he's getting deep in the tournament. So he said to this guy, I believe it was in the match against Elan, he said to him, what's your best map? And Elan said, Tourney 4. And the way it worked at that tournament, as far as I know, is I think you banned a map, and then the other guy banned a map, and then they either randomed it with a dice as to what map you play. And he just said to him, in that case, forget the dice or the coin or whatever system they use, let's just play your best map. So let's play Tourney 4. A map that, yes, C3 could play, but he wasn't known as like some world-famous Tourney 4 player, like, for example, 0-4 was, or Blue, or these other, or Machiavelli, these other legendary rail players. So he just said, hey, if that's your best map, let's play that map. Beat the guy on that map, en route to then finishing 4th in the tournament. Also in Quake 3, in TDM, there was a team that rose up to be very dominant. They were called Unmatched. They were this German team with Stellam, Slinger, ZYZ, and Neok. They were these legendary players, a bunch of them from Quake 2, and they had an amazing style of TDM play because they used to play a pure control style. They would play very slow-paced. They wouldn't give up many kills. They'd only go for kills that were certain. They'd work in packs. They'd control the armors. They'd make sure people couldn't get to weapons. They'd control the higher ground or the more advantageous ground, and they'd just kind of choke you out on the map, and people really struggled to beat them. They won a number of tournaments, and later on, like 3 of them, I think it was, went on and were with the SK team and also had success, and they won Euro Cups, the best competitions in Europe for Quake at the time. And along came this team called Ice Climbers, IC, and these were a bunch of players that you'll know, Toxic, his brother Gopher, Fox later on. There was a bunch of very, very skilled players. And what happened was, they didn't play this style at all. They came along and they played what was called the CES style, which actually came from Quake World, which is the game they came from, which is where you just rush the people and you try to use your aim and try to make it a war of attrition. You just output so much damage, they're doing damage to you, and you're overwhelming them into positions so they can't just hold weapons. You're trying to constantly make it dangerous for them so they can't check the timers on the items, because you're going to constantly suicide into them with no weapons necessarily and keep trying to attack all the time. And with this all-out aggro style, relying on aim, which admittedly They had Toxic, amazing aimer. They had very skilled player like Fox. And with this chaotic style of play, they won some games against the unmatched SK team, and they lost some games. But you know what? They had a style which was kind of like that boxer, that Street Fighter style, where it's like, you just want to say, right, you know what? Let's just both sit in the pocket. I'll take your best shot. You take my best shot. Well, I'll be willing to take a hit as long as I get a hit in, and let's see who wins at the end of this. Well, who the fuck doesn't like that style of boxing or that style of combat sports? That's what makes crowds go crazy. You think of like Roberto Duran style, you know. So then in League of Legends, I can give you a great example here. A lot of people forget this one. So at the Season 4 All-Stars tournament, it was essentially what is now the MSI. It was in theory the best team from each region, but unfortunately, that meant they invited SK Telecom, who'd won the last OGN season undefeated, but at the time the tournament actually took place, SK Telecom wasn't the best team in Korea. They hadn't been the best in the Masters tournament, where you combined both your sister teams and played as an overall squad and could pick whoever you wanted, and they hadn't been the best at that point in OGN Spring. This is the one where in the group stage they almost went out if it wasn't for some convenient loss by their sister team, which allowed them to get through because they'd lost to Katie Arrow, as you may remember. Now, at this point, though, they got invited to the tournament, so people think, right, this is a chance finally for Western teams, Chinese teams to potentially go head-to-head with SK Telecom because they're vulnerable, because they still had the same lineup as the last World Championship, but that was already where they were starting to fall off. Now, in the final, they played OMG, historically one of the best Chinese teams. At that point in time, the best Chinese team they had won the regular portion of the LPL Spring Split very shortly before this tournament. And in the finals, they played, and in game 1, SK Telecom gave OMG all their picks. And one of those picks was to give the other mid laner, who's called Shiyang, Syndra. And now Syndra was his best champion. Now listen, some people now, because he was only at the time a substitute for Cool, and Cool later came back, and Syndra switched to being a top laner, and it was never as much of a factor later. A lot of people like to write it off and downplay it, like, you see, he was only a one trick on Syndra, and he wasn't that good a player actually, and he was just lucky with the meta. But here's the thing, at the time, Shiyang was not only one of the best on Syndra, very dangerous, but he'd been very good in LPL. His team was at the top of the split, as I said. And at the time, yes, he was a substitute, but he'd helped this team become the best team in China at that point in time. Obviously, EDG took over and later won the split. Now, in game 1, they gave Shiyang Syndra. He did pretty decently. His team in general had an amazing game. At the end, SKT out-macroed them, out-team-fight them, and won the game. In game 3 of the series, which was the close-out game with SK Telecom up 2-0, Faker picked Syndra into Shiyang, who picked Orianna, which obviously is famously always a good lane matchup against everything. Now, in this lane matchup at that point in time, Syndra is supposed to get... well, first of all, in the first game, when he played against Syndra, and Faker was on Orianna. Yeah, that's the way around it was. Game 1, Faker was on Orianna, Shiyang was on Syndra. Now, Syndra's supposed to wreck that lane. Faker beat him in lane. Later on, beat him in the game itself. In game 3, Faker picks Syndra, and they win the game, and he outmatches Shiyang and shows him some crazy shit on Syndra. Now, here's some details you might not realize, because you think, well, Faker was the best player in the world. Faker was the best mid laner in the world. It's not crazy that he could play Syndra, right? Faker had not played Syndra in that All-Stars tournament prior to the final. He had not played Syndra in that season of OGN. He had not played it in the previous season of OGN when the team had gone 15-0 undefeated. He had not played it in OGN Masters, which ran simultaneous to this very season of OGN that was still going on at the time, OGN being the precursor to LCK, essentially. Faker was not known as a Syndra player. In fact, to this day, I think he's only played something like 11 games on it, and obviously a bunch of those are more recently. So this was not in any sense Faker's best champion, but why did he pick it? Well, after the tournament, Faker actually said, I saw his Syndra, referring to game 1 of Shiyang, and I wanted to show the fans how much better she can be. Right? That is straight baller. It's arrogance, it's ridiculous confidence, it's baller as fuck though, isn't it? I'll give you a couple of sports examples, because these are some classic ones I've got for you. So Anderson Silva, the truly great middleweight champion of the UFC for many years, arguably the best fighter of all time in any MMA weight class, had a fight. It was an exhibition match at light heavyweight against Stefan Bonner, who was obviously never in a world-class light heavyweight, but a heavier weight up. And he was certainly a gamer. He's a guy who's hung in there, who fought, who'd even fought against John Jones and had a pretty good match. And Anderson Silva got put, due to cage movement, in a position where he was against the fence, which is one of the worst places to be against someone who's a striker and someone who likes to utilize wrestling and dirty wrestling and boxing dirty boxing up against the cage, and he just stayed there. And famously, Anderson Silva was amazing at going like into the matrix and dodging and weaving. So he was doing this, but he was getting tagged by shots every now and then he got off the fence. So what he did was he did this movement, and he moved himself back onto the fence, even though he had the open cage at this point. And now he told Stephan Bonner, come on. And he kept doing this like 2 or 3 times. He put himself on the cage, let Stephan Bonner tee off on him, try to dodge as much as he can. When he got sick of it, he just decided to charge forwards, flying knee Stephan Bonner in the solar plexus, crushing him. So he was on the ground. It was a TKO, and the fight was over instantly. What ridiculous arrogance, yet what exhilarating arrogance of excellence. Because imagine how great you would have to be to even be able to conceive of that and then to execute the game plan itself. Likewise, Anderson Silva had watched the movie, the great martial arts movie, I think it came out in 2003, called Ong Bak, which is a fantastic like Muay Thai movie. And he told his coaches, like, oh, I want to do this move like he did in that movie where he uppercuts him like with the back of his elbow and knocks him out. And he's fighting a guy, I can't remember the guy's name, it was a British guy in like Cage Rage, I think, in the UK. And his coach just told him, don't do this. So he couldn't practice this move. He had to practice it with his wife using a pillow on the bed. And in the fight, in the middle of the fight, he just decides, fuck it, I'm just going to pull this out. And does that and uppercuts the guy, knocks him out completely, wins the fight. Again, someone who was a dangerous opponent, someone you don't fuck around with. Ridiculous, isn't it? John Jones actually was famous for this type of thing. Well, what he would do is he had such an all-around game. He would pick your strong suit and beat you with it. So when he fought Shogun, who was the champion, he kickboxed the fuck out of him. Shogun's one of the greatest Muay Thai strikers we've ever seen in him, mate. He was an amazing fighter. No one wanted to fight him stand-up. He just beat Lyoto Machida, who was an amazing karate practitioner. Then he went against Chael Sonnen, Daniel Cormier, people who've been world-class wrestlers, and he out-wrestled them. He took them down in these fights. Now, if you contrast this against someone like Lyoto Machida, who famously had a very defensive striking style, a counter-striking style, would use his karate and movement to get out of the way, to take as little damage as possible, put a little bit of damage on you, win on points often, and people would say, oh, these are fucking boring fights. But you know what? He became a champion doing that. He became a fantastic fighter with a very long career as a result of that. But it wasn't as exhilarating, wasn't it? It wasn't as daring. He was just playing to win the fight. He wasn't playing to be the craziest fighter or the most daring fighter or the best fighter necessary. And that's the point I want to make about this kind of arrogance of excellence, this exhilarating arrogance of excellence, is that it is unnecessary. And that's what makes it fantastic, because it is unnecessary both in terms of if you want to win and whether you want to make that victory certain, because often you put your victory at more risk by doing this kind of a style. Now, what's funny is we all accept that people will at times play boring or play safe if it means that they increase their chance to win, right? We all think, well, that's fair enough. I mean, the aim of the game is to win. The aim of the tournament and being a pro is to be the champion. And so, yeah, I guess winning is all that matters, right? But here's what I actually think is brilliant about some of these instances when they try it and it works, is that these are more about the joy of playing, of competition, of testing yourself against not only someone good, but their best quality and seeing if you can beat that and overcome them. Not playing it safe or getting them in a weaker map or matchup or attacking only at their weaknesses or playing defensively and only taking advantageous situations for you. And funnily enough, other competitors always massively respect these kinds of people, because on some level they know that this is actually, this kind of a move, this kind of a mentality is about proving you are the best, not simply the winner based on the format of how the rules decide who wins on points or whatever else. In this sense, this is something I'll one day make a whole video about. Actually, one thing I really appreciate with this is while the history books will only remember the winners and people who had great placings, and therefore playing very safe ensures you will get a great matchup like that, first of all, you'll never get the true respect of being the most dominant, the most amazing looking champion. Secondly, I think on some level, victory is an amazing byproduct. It's perhaps the best byproduct of being a fantastic player and having well-rounded skills, but it can at times be a shitty goal. If that's your only goal and you only care about is getting to that by any means, you won't always produce the greatest fights. You won't always know if you were the best. You'll never know if you could have beaten some aspect. So yes, it's a gamble. Yes, you have to weigh it up. I'm certainly not suggesting people go this route, but when they can do it and when they can pull it off, is there anything more exciting in sports or esports?